Pay attention to this police evidence photo from a quiet residential street in Portland, Maine. You're looking at a silver sedan parked in a garage. The windows are fogged up from the inside. The engine is running. A hose connects the exhaust pipe to the back window. Inside that car are two bodies, a man and a woman, both dead from carbon monoxide poisoning. Police will rule this a double suicide. Two people who made a pact to end their lives together. The case will be closed within weeks. But look closer at the positioning of those bodies, at the hose connection, at the way the doors were locked from the outside. What investigators are looking at isn't a suicide at all. It's a double murder staged so perfectly that it will take nearly a decade before anyone realizes the truth. And when that truth finally comes out, it will reveal a crime far more twisted than anyone could have imagined. You know that couple in your neighborhood who seems perfect? The ones with the nice house, the good jobs, the kids who do well in school, the ones who smile and wave and seem to have it all figured out? In Portland, Maine, in the early 2000s, there were two couples just like that. The Richardsons and the Marshalls. They lived in the same upscale neighborhood. Their kids went to the same schools. They attended the same church. From the outside, both families looked like they had the American dream. But behind closed doors, both marriages were falling apart. And the reason why would lead to one of the most shocking crimes in Maine history. This is the story of an affair that turned deadly, of a murder disguised as a suicide for almost 10 years, and of a respected doctor whose carefully constructed lies finally came crashing down. It's the story of how evil can hide behind a friendly smile and a respectable reputation, and how sometimes the truth takes years to surface, but when it does, it changes everything. Let me take you back to Portland, Maine in 2001. Dr. David Richardson was a 35-year-old dentist with a thriving practice in the heart of Portland. He was charming, successful, active in his church community. He and his wife, Catherine, had been married for 12 years and had 4 children together. Catherine Richardson was 32, a homemaker who devoted herself to raising their kids. She was deeply religious, involved in church activities, the kind of woman who baked cookies for school fundraisers and organized community events. Friends described her as sweet, trusting, maybe a little naive about the world. Living just a few blocks away were the Marshalls. Brian Marshall was 38, a police officer who'd served the Portland community for over 15 years. His wife, Grace, was 30, a part-time teacher who also had a strong connection to their local church. The two families knew each other through church. They'd attend services together, go to the same Bible study groups, have occasional dinners. On the surface, they were just two normal families living normal lives. But in early 2002, something shifted. David Richardson and Grace Marshall started an affair. It began innocently enough, or at least that's how they probably justified it. Extra conversations after church, a coffee here and there, text messages that started friendly and became flirtatious. Before long, they were meeting in secret, sneaking around behind their spouses' backs. For David, it was exciting. His marriage to Catherine had become routine, predictable. Catherine was focused on the kids and church activities. She wasn't interested in the things David wanted: travel, adventure, a more exciting life. Grace, on the other hand, made him feel young and alive again. For Grace, the affair filled a void in her own marriage. Brian worked long hours as a cop, came home tired and stressed. He wasn't emotionally available the way Grace needed. David was attentive, romantic, made her feel special. They convinced themselves they were in love, that what they had was real and meant to be. And they started fantasizing about a life together, without their spouses. By the summer of 2003, the affair was in full swing. They were meeting several times a week, exchanging hundreds of texts and emails, talking about running away together. But there was a problem: their spouses. Catherine would never agree to a divorce. She was deeply religious and believed marriage was sacred. Even if David asked for a divorce, she'd fight it. And she'd get the kids, the house, probably half of his dental practice. David had built his entire life and reputation in Portland. A divorce would ruin him professionally and financially. Brian was even more complicated. As a police officer, he had a gun and training. If he found out about the affair, who knows what he might do? Grace was terrified of confronting him, so David and Grace came up with another solution. A terrible, unthinkable solution. What if Catherine and Brian just disappeared? At first, they talked about it hypothetically, just venting, just fantasizing. But gradually, the fantasy became a plan, and the plan became an obsession. David, with his medical background, knew about drugs and how the body worked. He started researching ways to kill someone that would look natural or accidental. Grace, meanwhile, kept detailed notes about Brian's schedule, his routines, when he'd be vulnerable. By September 2003, they'd decided on a method. Carbon monoxide poisoning staged to look like a double suicide. It was perfect. They thought both Brian and Catherine had been under stress. Brian with his demanding job, Catherine with her husband pulling away emotionally. If they were found dead together in a car, it would look like they'd discovered the affair and made a suicide pact. Everyone would feel sorry for them, and David and Grace would be free to be together as grieving widow and widower. The plan was set for September 19, 2003. David told Catherine he had an early morning meeting and would be leaving before dawn. Grace told Brian she was going to visit a sick friend overnight. Both of them had alibis prepared, but that's not what happened. On the evening of September 18th, David gave Catherine a drink laced with sleeping pills. He told her it would help her relax. She'd been having trouble sleeping lately because of tension in their marriage. Catherine, trusting her husband completely, drank it without question. Once Catherine was unconscious, David called Grace. She drove over to the Richardson house, leaving Brian asleep at home. Together, David and Grace loaded the unconscious Catherine into David's car and drove to a secluded location, an old abandoned garage on the outskirts of Portland. Then Grace went back home. She gave Brian the same treatment, sleeping pills in his evening tea. Once he was out, she called David, who came to help her move Brian's body to the same garage where Catherine was. By 4 a.m. on September 19th, both Catherine and Brian were in David's car in that garage, still unconscious from the drugs. David attached a hose from the exhaust pipe to the back window, sealed it with duct tape, and started the engine. He and Grace waited outside the garage, holding hands as carbon monoxide filled the car. It took about 45 minutes. Neither Catherine nor Brian ever woke up. Once they were certain both victims were dead, David and Grace staged the scene. They positioned the bodies to look like Catherine and Brian had been sitting together when they died. They left a vague, typed note about being overwhelmed by life's pressures. They locked the car doors from the inside using a technique David had researched, a coat hanger threaded through a crack in the window. Then they went home separately and waited for someone to find the bodies. The bodies were discovered around 10 a.m. on September 19th. 2003, a maintenance worker at the industrial park, where the garage was located, noticed the car with its engine still running. When he looked inside and saw two people slumped over, he immediately called 911. Police and paramedics arrived quickly, but there was nothing they could do. Both victims had been dead for hours. The car was filled with toxic fumes. The scene was exactly what it appeared to be, a double suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning. When police identified the bodies as Catherine Richardson and Brian Marshall, shockwaves went through the Portland community. These were respected, well-known people. Catherine was a beloved church volunteer. Brian was a decorated police officer. Why would they kill themselves? And why together? Detectives started investigating, and almost immediately, they discovered the affair between David Richardson and Grace Marshall. Friends came forward saying they'd noticed David and Grace getting closer over the past year. Text messages on the victims' phones showed that Catherine had confronted David about Grace just days before her death. Brian's partner at the police department said Brian had mentioned suspecting his wife was having an affair. The narrative practically wrote itself. Catherine and Brian had discovered their spouses were cheating. Devastated, feeling betrayed and hopeless, they'd decided to end their lives together. It was tragic, but it made sense. The suicide note, though brief and impersonal, seemed to confirm it. David and Grace played their parts perfectly. David appeared devastated at Catherine's funeral, breaking down in front of the whole congregation. Grace was similarly grief-stricken at Brian's memorial service, supported by Brian's fellow officers who felt terrible for the widow of their fallen comrade. In the weeks after the deaths, David and Grace were careful not to see each other publicly. They knew people would be watching, suspicious of their relationship, so they waited. They grieved publicly. They played the role of traumatized survivors. The police investigation wrapped up within a month. The medical examiner confirmed carbon monoxide poisoning. The note, though not handwritten, didn't raise enough red flags to warrant further investigation. The doors had been locked from the inside. Everything pointed to suicide. Case closed. For David and Grace, everything had gone according to plan. They'd gotten away with murder. But here's what they didn't count on: living with what they'd done. In the months after the murders, David and Grace finally started seeing each other openly. They waited a respectable amount of time, about 6 months, before making their relationship public. They told friends they'd found comfort in each other through their shared grief, that they understood each other's pain in a way no one else could. Some people were uncomfortable with how quickly they got together, but most of the community accepted it. They were both single now, both lonely, both trying to rebuild their lives. Why shouldn't they be happy? David and Grace got married in 2005, just over a year after their spouses' deaths. They combined their families, David's 4 kids and Grace's 2, into one household. From the outside, they were the perfect blended family, proof that love and healing were possible even after tragedy. But inside that house, things were far from perfect. David started having nightmares. He'd wake up in the middle of the night seeing Catherine's face, hearing her voice. The guilt was eating him alive, but he couldn't tell anyone, couldn't go to therapy, couldn't confess to a priest. He was trapped with his secret. Grace, meanwhile, became paranoid. She was convinced people suspected them. Every sideways glance, every whispered conversation felt like an accusation. She started drinking heavily to cope with the anxiety. Their marriage, built on murder and lies, was toxic from the start. They fought constantly. David became controlling and emotionally abusive. Grace became bitter and resentful. The kids, caught in the middle, suffered, but they were stuck with each other. They were each other's accomplice. If one of them talked, both would go to prison. So they stayed together, miserable and trapped in a hell of their own making. Years passed. 5 years. 7 years. 9 years. David's dental practice thrived. He became even more successful, opened a second location, was respected in the community. But behind the professional facade, he was falling apart. He started drinking, started taking pills to sleep, different pills to wake up, more pills to get through the day, and then he started doing something even worse. Around 2008, David began sedating female patients more heavily than necessary during dental procedures. At first, he told himself it was for their comfort, but then he started touching them inappropriately while they were unconscious, taking advantage of them when they were vulnerable and unable to resist. It started small but escalated over time. More patients, more violations. David had crossed a line with Catherine and Brian's murders, and now he'd convinced himself there were no lines anymore. He was untouchable. He'd gotten away with murder. What was a little assault compared to that? But in early 2012, one of David's patients woke up during a procedure. She was groggy, but conscious enough to realize David's hands were somewhere they shouldn't be. She confronted him afterward, threatened to report him. David panicked. He begged her not to say anything, offered her money, offered free dental work for life. The patient left his office confused and traumatized, not sure what to do. That night, David Richardson had a breakdown. The guilt, the fear, the lies, it all came crashing down at once. He'd spent 9 years living with the knowledge that he'd murdered 2 innocent people, and now he was abusing his patients too. He couldn't carry it anymore. He drove to the police station and asked to speak to a detective, and he confessed to everything. When David Richardson walked into the Portland Police Department on March 15, 2012, detectives had no idea what they were about to hear. David asked to speak to someone about the Catherine Richardson and Brian Marshall deaths from 2003. The detective who took his statement assumed he was coming forward with new information, maybe something he'd remembered about his late wife's state of mind. Instead, David said 5 words that changed everything. "I killed them both." For the next 6 hours, David Richardson gave a detailed confession. He explained the affair with Grace, the plan to murder their spouses, every step of how they'd done it, the sleeping pills, the car, the carbon monoxide, the staged suicide scene. He provided details that only the killer would know. Detectives were stunned. The Catherine Richardson and Brian Marshall case had been closed for 9 years. Everyone believed it was a suicide. Now they were learning it had been a carefully planned double murder all along. But David wasn't done confessing. He also admitted to sexually assaulting multiple female patients while they were under anesthesia. He gave names, dates, described what he'd done. It was a complete unburdening of guilt. When asked why he was confessing now, David broke down in tears. He said he couldn't live with the lies anymore, that the guilt was destroying him, that he wanted to face justice for what he'd done. Police immediately took David into custody and began verifying his confession. They pulled the original case files from 2003. They went back to the crime scene location. They started interviewing David's dental patients, who he'd named as assault victims. Everything David said checked out. The confession was credible. But there was one huge question. What about Grace Marshall? David's confession implicated her as an equal participant in the murders. She'd helped plan it, helped drug Brian, helped stage the scene. If David was guilty, so was she. Detectives brought Grace in for questioning. At first, she denied everything. She claimed David was lying, having some kind of mental breakdown, trying to take her down with him out of spite. Their marriage had ended badly. They'd divorced in 2010, and she insisted this was revenge. But investigators weren't buying it. They had David's detailed account that matched the physical evidence. They pulled phone records from 2003 showing hundreds of calls and texts between David and Grace in the weeks before the murders. They found old emails where Grace and David discussed being together no matter what it takes. And then they found the smoking gun, the police evidence photos from the original crime scene. Remember the pre-intro? That photo of the car in the garage? When forensic experts re-examined those photos nearly a decade later, they noticed something that had been missed the first time. The way the hose was attached to the exhaust pipe required someone to be outside the car. The angle was wrong for someone inside to have done it, and the duct tape sealing the connection had fingerprints on it, partial prints that were too degraded to identify in 2003 with the technology available then. But in 2012, with advanced forensic techniques, those prints were enhanced, and they matched Grace Marshall's fingerprints. She'd been there, she'd helped set up the murder scene. The physical evidence proved it. When confronted with this evidence, Grace's story changed. She admitted she'd been there, but claimed David had forced her to help. She said she was terrified of him, that he'd threatened to kill her too if she didn't cooperate. She tried to paint herself as another victim, but investigators didn't believe her. The emails and texts showed she'd been an enthusiastic participant in planning the murders. Witnesses came forward saying Grace had talked about wanting to be free of Brian. She wasn't a victim. She was a co-conspirator. Grace Marshall was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The case that had been closed for 9 years was suddenly the biggest news story in Maine. A respected dentist and his mistress had murdered their spouses and staged it as a suicide, then lived freely for nearly a decade. It was shocking, horrifying, unbelievable. The trials were held separately. David's trial came first in late 2012. The prosecution laid out the timeline of the affair, the murder plan, David's detailed confession. They brought in forensic experts who explained how the crime scene had been staged. They showed the jury the evidence photos and explained what the reanalysis had revealed. David's defense didn't really dispute the facts. Instead, they argued for leniency based on his confession and mental state. They painted him as a man who'd made a terrible mistake, been living in torment ever since, and had finally done the right thing by confessing. The jury wasn't sympathetic. After 3 days of deliberation, they found David Richardson guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder and multiple counts of sexual assault. Grace's trial followed in early 2013. She maintained her claim that David had coerced her, but the evidence told a different story. The prosecution presented those emails and texts showing her active involvement in planning. They showed how she'd helped drug Brian and move his body. They demonstrated that she'd benefited from the murders and lived happily with David for years afterward. Grace's defense tried to argue that she'd been psychologically manipulated by David, that she was afraid for her life. They brought in expert witnesses on domestic abuse and coercive control, but the jury wasn't convinced. Too much evidence showed Grace as an equal partner in the crime. After a longer deliberation, 5 days, they found her guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. The convictions of David Richardson and Grace Marshall brought some closure to the families of Catherine Richardson and Brian Marshall, but the pain of their losses was compounded by the betrayal. Catherine's family, her parents, siblings, friends, had spent 9 years believing she'd taken her own life. They'd struggled with guilt, wondering if they'd missed warning signs, if they could have prevented her death. Learning that she'd actually been murdered, drugged, and killed by the husband she'd trusted completely reopened all those wounds in the most horrific way. Brian Marshall's fellow police officers were devastated. They'd mourned him as a brother who died by suicide, not knowing he'd been murdered. The betrayal by Grace, the woman they'd comforted and supported as a grieving widow, felt like a personal attack on all of them. The children from both families were left to grapple with an unthinkable reality. Catherine's 4 kids and Brian's 2 children learned that one of their parents had been murdered and the other had helped kill them. The psychological damage was immense and lasting. Catherine's parents established a foundation in her memory to support victims of domestic violence and to fund research into identifying staged crimes. They became advocates for better training for first responders in recognizing when suicides might actually be homicides. Brian's police department implemented new protocols for death investigations, including more thorough forensic analysis and longer review periods before cases are closed as suicides. David Richardson's dental patients who he'd assaulted came forward publicly. Their bravery in speaking out led to stricter oversight of medical professionals and better protections for patients under anesthesia. At the sentencing hearings, family members gave victim impact statements that left everyone in the courtroom in tears. Catherine's mother talked about her daughter's kindness, her dedication to her children, her faith in God and in the goodness of people. David took advantage of that goodness, she said. He used her trust to murder her. Brian's partner from the police force talked about the officer he'd worked alongside for years, about Brian's dedication to justice and protecting others. The irony, he said, is that the person who needed protection from evil was Brian himself, and that evil was sleeping in his own bed. The judge, in pronouncing sentences, called the crimes among the most cold-blooded and calculated murders he'd encountered. He noted that both David and Grace had not only killed their spouses, but had continued to victimize others for years. Grace by accepting sympathy as a grieving widow, David by assaulting his patients. David Richardson was convicted on the following charges: 2 counts of first-degree murder, multiple counts of sexual assault, and tampering with evidence. He received 2 consecutive life sentences for the murders with a minimum of 25 years before parole eligibility, plus an additional 15 years for the assault charges. He will be at least 85 years old before he's eligible for release. Grace Marshall was convicted on the following charges: 2 counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and tampering with evidence. She received 2 consecutive life sentences with a minimum of 22 years before parole eligibility. She will be at least 74 years old before she can apply for parole. Catherine Richardson was 32 years old when she was murdered. She was a devoted mother, a faithful friend, and a woman who believed in the goodness of people. She trusted her husband completely, never imagining he was capable of such evil. Brian Marshall was 38 years old when he was murdered. He spent his career protecting the citizens of Portland, never knowing that the greatest threat to his life was in his own home. They both deserve so much better than what happened to them. They deserve to watch their children grow up, to grow old together with people who truly loved them, to live full lives. Instead, they were murdered by the people they trusted most, their deaths staged as suicide, their memories tainted for nearly a decade. But the truth finally came out. Justice was finally served, and Catherine and Brian are remembered now not as suicide victims, but as what they truly were, murder victims whose lives were stolen by people too selfish and cowardly to face the consequences of their choices. Rest in peace, Catherine Richardson and Brian Marshall. Your families never stopped loving you, and now, finally, the truth about your deaths is known.